Hello, everyone. My name's Ruben Sharma. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, we'll be talking about the UFC and its relationship with media and how they grow each other. The Ultimate Fighting Championship was founded in 1993. Until 1996, it was exclusively on pay per view. At this point, the UFC was known as an extreme violent sport, lawless and animalistic. Broadcasters refused to show any UFC event on their channel. This until 1997, where they organized a deal with Fox Sport and the sport became officially sanctioned. However, in 2001, the Zuffa Group, led by the Fertitta brothers and Dana White, brought the UFC for $2 million and it took it back to pay-per-view for a short period of time. Because eventually in 2005, the UFC signed with Spike TV. And with this new relationship, the UFC started to produce the Ultimate Fighter series, as well as produce more fight nights and gain more exposure to prelim fights. At this point, the UFC was gaining more traction in media and was getting more sponsorship, and the pay-per-view stats skyrocketed. Media was seeing the UFC as more of a sport and rather than a boisterous brawl. From 2011 to 2018, the UFC signed with Fox Sport, and that 7 years was valued at $700 million. At this point, the UFC was competing with major league sports and was earning partnerships with large brands like Reebok. Then from 2019 to current day, the UFC has been with ESPN and introduced shows like Dana White Contender Series and giving the company global exposure like never before. Now the UFC have signed a 7-year deal with Paramount starting in 2026, and this deal has been valued at $7.7 billion. With large deals like this and other channels like merch, tickets, and pay-per-view, it allows for the brand to sign bigger athletes, pay fighters more, and put more funds into the product for at-home and in-person experience. The media helped the UFC grow by turning it from being banned underground sport into a mainstream spectacle. The media giving huge exposure legitimized it as a real sport and attracted sponsors, fans, and global coverage. Broadcast deals with major networks and streaming platforms let the UFC air in over 170 countries around the world, making fights accessible worldwide, building international fan bases, and allowing them to host events in places like Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. UFC have made an effort to sign athletes from around the world. As research from Zheng Li says, fans enhance the emotional connection and national identity of naturalized athletes by constructing cultural proximity, behavioral neutrality, and ethnic group legitimacy. However, with such a large global audience, fights are held worldwide, but due to time zones, fight times have been altered to accommodate generally the US media. A recent example of this would be UFC 304, held in Manchester in July this year. This main card started at 3 a.m. local time, concluding at 6 a.m., which is atypical for major sporting events in the UK and made the fights happen at extreme early hours in the morning. This scheduling was primarily to ensure events aired during prime time in the United States, aligning with the UFC's strategy to maximize viewership and pay-per-view sales in the US market. With that, the broadcasters have a lot of responsibility to look after the product, especially piracy and illegal streaming. With the cost of pay-per-view, fans resort to the convenience of online streams to watch the fights. 40% of pay-per-view watches are illegally streamed, taking money away from broadcasters and has always been an issue in sports. Also, pay-per-view culture has declined over the years due to the shift in technology, media habits, and consumer expectations. Jong et al. Have found fans prefer flat-rate streaming services like ESPN Plus, DAZN, UFC Fight Pass, overpaying £60 for a single event. Subscription models offer more content for less money, including highlights, archives, and behind-the-scenes footage, making pay-per-views feel outdated. The UFC have started to use media differently by utilizing platforms specific to how the fans want to consume content. Using Instagram and TikTok, it's very easy to show highlights and stunning moments using short form content, as it keeps fans that didn't watch the event up to date with fights and athletes. And with pages like with 49 million followers on Instagram and nearly 18 million followers on TikTok, it is key to keep these pages up to date and sharing the right content. These pages are constantly posting during live events, and all the platforms are promoting each other at the same time, Like during a pay-per-view, you sometimes see X posts come in the bottom left corner, and it will show thoughts of fans and big names watching the events at the same time. There is also a content abundance with the UFC in the fact that anyone can be a producer. So people at home can be making edits and other and other forms of content around the UFC, posting these online, growing athletes and growing the sport as a whole. These platforms allow athletes to grow as a character. Similarly, on YouTube, the UFC posts their embedded series, which is the behind the scenes of Fight Week, getting the viewers hyped and excited for Saturday night. Also on YouTube, athletes have made their own channels, with many of them having millions of subscribers. And doing this has allowed fight fans and new fans to learn about the fighters even more and become attached to them, eventually supporting them when they fight, potentially buying the pay-per-view or going back to their old fights and potentially even going to see them in real life. Online, the UFC used short form content to adhere to the shorter attention span of viewers. Geraldo Luque and Alfando state that the consumption figures for digital environments, mainly social media, show the addictive uses associated with problems, including challenges of sustaining attention. However, the UFC's main content output is on Saturday night, and these events generally go on for 6 hours. Keeping attention of fight fans for that long is tough, and that's why the UFC utilize gamification to ensure that fans are watching the fights as early as the first fight on the card and breaking down the card into multiple short experiences. Turning fights into interactive game-like events, fans can now place live bets on outcomes around finishes or even specific moves through integrated apps and broadcasts. It boosts in fan engagement and viewership. Doing this has found that inclusion of betting odds in live broadcasts increased fan enjoyment and had a strong association with intentions to bet, stated by Zhu et al. The UFC have collaborated with EA to produce 5 games so far, and in these games you can use past and current fighters that maybe you haven't heard of before and become fans of individuals, potentially leading them to go back to watch their old fights or be watching them live the next time they fight. This is an example of conversion culture. Gamification in the UFC means adding game-like elements to how fights are shown and experienced, making fans feel more involved rather than just watching passively. Aspects like replays, camera work, and graphics make the viewing experience more game-like. Broadcasts now feature live stats like strikes landed, control time, and win possibilities, similar to performance dashboards in gaming. This creates a sense of strategy and analytics, engaging the viewers as players trying to predict outcomes. Rojas Riojos studied how media outlets use game-like elements in sports coverage by creating interactive features. It finds that gamification in sport media coverage helps inform the audiences, especially lesser known sports or fans, and increases attention and engagement. Along the same lines, the UFC are relatively reliant on conversion culture. This refers to how how the organization and its media ecosystem transform casual viewers into loyal, emotionally invested fans through immersive storytelling, digital engagement, and interactive broadcasting. Carl Spracklin argues that fans are not just spectators, but are participants, consuming, interacting, identifying, and that conversion culture is key to differentiate between spectators and fans. This has been done by the UFC in many methods, one being narrative-driven promotion. The UFC uses reality shows like The Ultimate Fighter, Dana White Contenders Series, and fighter documentaries to show personal storylines to turn fighters into relatable characters. This emotional connection converts one-time viewers into long-term fans and allows fans to feel like they have been following them from an early point in their UFC journey. As mentioned earlier, the cross-platform conversion through YouTube highlights, TikTok clips, embedded betting odds, and fan polls on X and Instagram. Audiences are not just watching, they're participating. This constant engagement encourages viewers to shift from passive consumption to active involvement.